In the hills of Appalachia, silence has a sound of its own. It settles into the valleys, clings to the trees, and lingers around places people avoid looking at for too long. In the late 1800s, one such place sat just beyond a narrow dirt road in rural West Virginia, a weather-beaten farm, owned by two sisters few people truly knew. The Pike property wasn't marked on most maps, and it didn't need to be. Everyone nearby already knew where it was. More importantly, they knew where not to go. The barn stood behind the main house, half hidden by thick trees and years of neglect. Its wood had darkened with age, the doors warped and reinforced with heavy iron locks that seemed excessive for storing livestock. No animals were ever seen entering or leaving it. No sounds came from inside, and yet the barn was always locked, always guarded, always avoided. Locals noticed these things, of course. They noticed how the sisters rarely left the property, how supplies were purchased in odd quantities, how strangers occasionally appeared in town with the Pike sisters and were never seen again. But Appalachia at the turn of the century was a place governed by unspoken rules. You didn't pry, you didn't ask questions, and you certainly didn't involve yourself in someone else's land. This was a time before widespread law enforcement, before reliable record keeping, before missing persons databases. Men drifted through rural towns looking for work, farmhands, travelers, laborers chasing rumors of wages and shelter. When one disappeared, it was easy to assume he simply moved on. In places like this, disappearance didn't always mean alarm. Sometimes it barely meant a footnote, and so the barn remained untouched. Seasons passed, winters froze its hinges, summers baked its walls. Children dared each other to run past the property line, hearts pounding, swearing they heard things, scraping sounds, muffled groans, chains rattling faintly beneath the wind. Adults dismissed it as imagination, or maybe they didn't. Maybe dismissing it was easier than facing what curiosity might uncover. The Pike sisters themselves were rarely seen together in public. When they were, people remembered the way conversations stopped, the way eyes followed them until they disappeared down the road. There was no single incident, no clear accusation, just a growing sense that something about them felt wrong. Not dangerous in a loud way, dangerous in a quiet, patient way. By the time the barn door was finally opened, it had been sealed for years, long enough for rumors to rot into legend, long enough for fear to become routine, long enough for an entire community to convince itself that whatever was behind that door was none of their business. But history has a way of forcing doors open eventually, and when this one finally gave way, it revealed a truth far worse than anyone had dared to imagine. To understand how something so horrific could exist for so long, you first have to understand the women at the center of it. The Pike sisters were not outsiders who suddenly appeared in the hills of West Virginia. They were known, familiar, part of the landscape in a way that made them easy to overlook and difficult to question. They lived alone on the family property after the deaths of their parents, inheriting land that had been in the Pike name for decades. In rural Appalachia, that mattered. Long-time ownership carried a quiet authority. It meant your business was your business, and outsiders, whether journalists or lawmen, were treated with suspicion. The sisters leaned into that culture of isolation, rarely socializing, rarely attending church, and almost never inviting anyone onto their land unless there was a reason. Physically, there was nothing remarkable about them. No theatrical villainy, no dramatic behavior that screamed danger, and that, perhaps, was what made them so unsettling. They were calm, reserved, methodical. When townspeople spoke of them, it was always with hesitation, as if choosing the wrong word might invite trouble. People described their eyes lingering too long, their silences stretching uncomfortably, their politeness feeling practiced rather than natural. They made their living through farming and small trade, but their true activities were never entirely clear. Supplies were bought in bulk chains, tools, feed far more than two women would reasonably need. When asked, they gave simple answers: livestock, repairs, preparation for winter. Nothing that could be easily challenged without proof, and proof, at the time, was hard to come by. Men passing through town were often pointed toward the Pike property when they asked about work. The sisters were known to help temporary laborers to fix fencing, clear land, or tend animals. For drifters and travelers, it sounded ideal: food, shelter, and pay, all in a region where opportunities were scarce. No contracts, no witnesses, just a handshake and a walk down a dirt road that few ever returned from. What's chilling is that this arrangement didn't raise alarms right away. In an era when people lived transient lives, a man disappearing wasn't immediately suspicious. Townsfolk assumed he moved on, or found work elsewhere, or simply chose not to return. And if someone did ask questions, the Pike sisters had a reputation for discouraging curiosity without ever making explicit threats. There were rumors, of course, whispers traded in hushed tones, stories of shouting heard at night, of chains clanking when the wind carried sound just right, of figures glimpsed through cracks in the barn walls. But rumors require belief to become. Action, and belief was something people were reluctant to admit, because accepting the rumors meant accepting something far worse. That to women everyone recognized were capable of unimaginable cruelty, and that recognizing it would demand responsibility. So instead, people looked away, and the Pike sisters continued, untouched, unchallenged, until the day silence was no longer an option. The disappearances didn't happen all at once. They never do. They came slowly, quietly, scattered across months and years, just enough distance between each one to avoid forming a pattern. Anyone felt confident naming out loud. At the turn of the 20th century, rural America was full of men on the move. Railroad workers, seasonal farmhands, lumber laborers, miners chasing rumors of work. Many of them carried little more than a bedroll and a name that rarely made it into any official ledger. When they passed through a town, they might stay a night, maybe a week, and then vanish down another road. That kind of life made disappearance easy to explain and even easier to ignore. But in this region, something was off. Locals began to notice familiar faces that never seemed to come back. Men who had been seen asking for work at the general store. Men who shared a meal at the tavern, mentioned plans for a short job on a nearby farm, And then, nothing. No goodbye, no return, no rumors of where they went next. At first, people shrugged it off. He moved on, found better pay elsewhere. That's the way drifters are. Each explanation was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a convenient shield against deeper questions. But over time, the list grew longer, and the coincidences harder to dismiss. A troubling detail kept resurfacing in quiet conversations. Many of these men had last been seen heading toward the Pike property, sometimes accompanied by one of the sisters, sometimes simply mentioned in passing. I heard there's work up that way. It was never enough to accuse, just enough to unsettle. Families rarely came looking. Many of the missing men had none. Nearby, some had cut ties years earlier. Others used nicknames, aliases, or false names. In an era without centralized records, tracking someone who didn't he want to be tracked or who could no longer speak for himself was nearly impossible. This wasn't just a failure of law enforcement. It was a failure of infrastructure, of communication, of a system not built to protect people who lived on society's edges. And the Pike sisters understood that better than anyone. They operated in the gaps, in the spaces where no one was keeping count. Occasionally, someone would push a little harder. A shop owner might mention that too many men were disappearing for comfort. A neighbor might swear they heard voices coming from the barn late at night. But those concerns rarely traveled far. Confrontation carried risk, and the sisters' land was known as a place you didn't trespass unless you wanted trouble. There was also another, darker possibility one few wanted to acknowledge. That even if people suspected something, they didn't want to know the truth, because knowing would mean choosing a side. And choosing a side could make you the next person who vanished. So the men kept coming, and they kept disappearing. By the time anyone in authority began to pay attention, the number wasn't 1 or 2. It wasn't even 10. It was already far too many. And whatever was happening behind that locked barn door had been happening for a long time. The door had been locked for years. Everyone knew that. But on that cold morning in 1901, it wasn't rumor or fear guiding the hands that reached for it. It was authority, hesitation, and a sense that whatever lay on the other side would change everything. Accounts differ on what finally triggered the investigation. Some say it was a deliveryman who noticed movement inside the barn. Others claim a neighbor finally broke down after hearing screams one night. That didn't sound like animals. What is consistent across every version is this. Once the question was asked out loud, what is in that barn? It could no longer be ignored. When officials arrived at the Pike property, the sisters didn't run. They didn't panic. They didn't plead. Witnesses later described them as calm, almost indifferent, as if this moment had been expected for a long time. When asked about the barn, one of the sisters reportedly answered with a simple phrase, "There is no reason to go in there." That answer alone sealed the decision. The locks were heavy, iron, rusted from age, but well-maintained. Not the kind used for animals. Not the kind used for storage. They were the kind meant to keep something or someone from leaving. As the final lock was broken, the smell came first. It rolled out of the barn in a thick, suffocating wave, stale air mixed with waste, rot, and human decay. Several men reportedly stepped back, covering their mouths, unprepared for what years of confinement smell like when the door is finally opened. Then came the sound, low, weak, human. Inside, the darkness swallowed the light at first. It took a few seconds for eyes to adjust, and when they did, the scene that emerged was so unnatural that some officers later said it felt unreal, as if they were looking at something their minds refused to process. Chains lined the walls, not loosely scattered, fixed in place, organized, attached to iron rings bolted deep into the wooden beams. And at the end of those chains were men, 37 of them. Some stood when they saw the light, others couldn't. Many were skeletal, their clothes hanging off them like fabric draped over bone, beards matted, skin pale, eyes wide not with anger, but with disbelief, as if they weren't sure this moment was real. No one spoke at first, not the officers, not the sisters, not the men who had been waiting some for years for this exact sound of a door opening. There were no cages, no individual cells, just chains, spacing, and a system that suggested this wasn't chaos. It was routine. Food remnants sat in troughs. Water buckets were rationed. This wasn't a place of immediate execution. It was a place designed for containment, and that raised a question no one was ready to answer yet. Why were they kept alive? Because opening the door didn't just expose a crime. It exposed intent. And whatever that intent was, it was far more disturbing than murder. Once the shock of the discovery settled, the reality of what those 37 men had endured began to surface slowly, painfully, and in fragments. This wasn't just a room full of captives. It was a system that had reduced human beings to survival alone. Medical examinations later revealed what the eye could already see: severe malnutrition, infections left untreated for months, sometimes years, broken bones that had healed incorrectly, skin worn raw where iron chains had rubbed day after day. Some men could barely stand. Others hadn't walked freely in so long that their legs trembled under their own weight. A few tried to speak immediately, desperate to explain, to warn, to be heard before someone decided this was all a mistake. But many couldn't. Their voices were weak, their minds fogged from years of deprivation. For some, language itself had eroded. Sentences came out broken, fragmented, as if words were muscles they hadn't used in too long. What struck investigators most was the variety among the men. Different ages, different backgrounds. These weren't prisoners from one place or one event. They had arrived at different times, under different pretenses. Some had been there for months, others, shockingly, for years. Yet despite that, there was a strange order among them. Chains were spaced deliberately. Stronger men were positioned closer to food access points, weaker ones further away, surviving only because others shared what little they could. It was brutal, but not random. Someone had been managing this space, adjusting it, maintaining it. The men described a routine stripped of dignity. Food delivered once or twice a day. Minimal water. No explanation. No sense of time beyond the light that crept through cracks in the barn walls. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks into something that felt endless. Punishment was rare but effective. Those who resisted or tried to escape were isolated, moved, or restrained more tightly. The message spread quickly without needing to be spoken. Compliance meant survival. Perhaps the most haunting detail came from what wasn't there. There were no graves nearby, no signs of executions, no evidence of bodies being removed, which meant the sisters weren't killing these men quickly or often. Death wasn't the goal, survival was. That realization unsettled investigators even more than the chains themselves. Because keeping someone alive requires effort, planning, resources, intent. These men weren't forgotten. They were maintained as they were freed. Reactions varied. Some collapsed in relief, others cried. A few stared silently at the open door, unable or unwilling to step past it. When freedom finally arrives after years of captivity, it doesn't always feel real. Sometimes it feels dangerous and hovering in the background, watching the chaos unfold. Stood the Pike sisters, still calm, still composed, offering no explanations, showing no visible regret. 37. Lives had been reduced to shadows in a barn, and yet the most disturbing questions still hadn't been answered. What possible reason could justify keeping men alive like this? This was the question that lingered in every report, every whispered conversation, every uneasy glance exchanged between investigators. Why? Why go through the trouble of feeding, restraining, and sustaining 37 men year after year without killing them if this had been about violence alone? The outcome would have looked very different. Murder leaves evidence, but it also brings finality. What existed inside that barn was something slower, more deliberate, and far more unsettling. One theory centered on labor. In an isolated rural region, manpower was valuable. Strong men could work fields, repair structures, and perform physically demanding tasks. But witnesses found no evidence of large-scale farming or production on the Pike, property that would justify so many captives. The land wasn't prosperous. There were no excess crops, no unusual profits, no signs of an operation that required dozens of workers. Another theory suggested trafficking, selling men onward to other buyers. But again, there were no records, no trails, no known networks tied to the sisters. And if profit had been the motive, secrecy would have been essential. Keeping that many captives in one place would have been reckless. Then there was the most disturbing possibility of all. Food, water, movement, everything was controlled. Over time, resistance faded. Hope eroded. Psychologists would later describe this kind of environment as one designed not just to imprison bodies, but to break wills. Investigators began to suspect that the sisters' motives may not have been economic at all. Instead, the captivity itself, the power dynamic, was the purpose. The barn wasn't a means to an end. It was the end. This idea gained traction when officials examined how carefully the operation had been. Maintenance were replaced when worn. Injuries were treated just enough to prevent death. Weak men weren't discarded, they were repositioned, preserved, kept alive as long as possible. This wasn't neglect, it was management. Some historians later suggested the sisters may have believed they were justified, perhaps driven by warped ideology, trauma, or a belief system that never made it into official records. Others argued that isolation itself can distort morality over time, creating a world where control replaces conscience. What makes this explanation so unsettling is how ordinary it is. Just two people who quietly did something monstrous because no one stopped them. And for years, no one did. Because the sisters understood something crucial. Society notices violence when it's loud. It struggles to confront it, and that realization shifted the focus of the case. It was about a system that allowed such a place to exist at all, which raises another uncomfortable question. How much did the community really know? One of the most haunting aspects of this story isn't the barn itself. It's the silence surrounding it, the quiet, unspoken complicity of the people who lived nearby. Because the Pike property didn't exist in a vacuum, it existed in a small town, surrounded by neighbors, merchants, and passers-by, and yet, for years, no one stepped in. Why? Some explanations are simple. Fear. The sisters were known to be sharp, private, and not afraid to assert themselves. People worried about confrontation, about retaliation. And when the authorities did exist, they were overworked and far away. Asking questions wasn't just awkward, it could be fatal. Then there was disbelief. How do you confront a neighbor about something so monstrous? 37 men chained in a barn sounds impossible. It should be impossible. And when something defies belief, many choose denial over investigation. Better to assume rumor than face a reality too awful to process. Rumors did exist. Whispers of strange deliveries, chains clinking in the night, men disappearing and never returning. But rumor alone isn't enough. Proof is needed. And for proof, someone had to take action. Most people didn't. They avoided the subject. They told themselves it wasn't their business. Some even laughed it off when stories were shared. Nervous laughter, a way to dismiss anxiety. There was also complicity born from convenience. Transient laborers, missing men, untracked drifters. These were people society didn't always notice. Their absence could be shrugged off, ignored. This gap allowed evil to operate quietly. The sisters exploited it. They understood how the community's blind spots worked, and for decades, they relied on them. Even after the barn was discovered, investigators noted how many had suspected something for years. Yet no one had acted. The town collectively looked away, enabling a horror that might have been prevented with earlier intervention. This pattern, fear, disbelief, convenience isn't unique to the Pike case. Throughout history, atrocities have often occurred not only because of the perpetrator's actions, but because communities, families, and neighbors silently allow them. The Pike barn is a chilling reminder that inaction is a force in itself, capable of sustaining unimaginable cruelty. It also forces a reflection on human nature. How easily do we rationalize away discomfort? How quickly do we pretend we didn't hear, didn't see, didn't know? And most importantly, at what point does looking away make us part of the story? By the time authorities finally acted, 37 men had suffered years of captivity, while the town's collective hesitation had stretched decades. The community's silence wasn't just ignorance. It was a shield for horror, passive participation in the maintenance of human suffering. And once the investigation began, It became clear that uncovering the truth would be far more complex than opening a barn door. Statements conflicted. Memories had faded. Fear lingered. Because when evil thrives in silence, everyone becomes a witness, even those who never set foot inside. Once the barn was opened and the truth could no longer be ignored, the investigation began in earnest, but it was immediately complicated. This wasn't a simple case of trespassing or theft. Authorities faced a maze of challenges. Records for missing men were scarce. Names were often aliases. Families were distant or unaware. Witnesses stumbled over dates, locations, and sequences of events. Memories had faded or had been deliberately clouded by fear. Yet, what investigators did uncover was alarming. The Pike sisters maintained meticulous control over their captives. Each chain, each bucket, each ration of food and water was part of a carefully managed system. Someone had thought about these men every day, year after year. A methodical plan that blurred the line between obsession and monstrosity. Calm, composed, and eerily detached. They denied wrongdoing, claiming that the men were there voluntarily, that they were helping around the property. Investigators quickly realized that this explanation was impossible. The condition of the men, their weak bodies. Local authorities tried to follow leads beyond the property. Neighboring towns were questioned. Some individuals admitted they had suspected something, but most still refused to provide details. Fear had a long half-life in Appalachia, even after such a revelation. Many people found it easier to step back than to speak up. Evidence collection was slow and painstaking. Photographs captured skeletal frames, chains bolted to beams, and the stark, bare interior of the barn. Medical examinations documented the abuse, but nothing could fully capture the psychological toll. Years of isolation, uncertainty, and dependency had left invisible scars that would never fully heal. Even after arrests and initial charges, the case struggled to gain traction in the broader legal system. Record-keeping was inconsistent, and in a world still learning how to deal with such extraordinary crimes, the sisters' control over their domain made prosecution complicated. The investigation revealed a truth that was almost worse than the barn itself. Evil could operate quietly, systematically, and undetected. The law could uncover it, yes, but only after irreparable harm had already been done. The 37 men survived, but the impact of their captivity rippled through their lives and through the community, exposing vulnerabilities in society itself. By the end of the inquiry, the investigation had documented horrors, but it had also uncovered limitations. Fear, silence, and isolation had allowed this tragedy to continue for years, and it would take decades for history to even acknowledge it fully. Despite the shocking discoveries, the Pike sisters' case did not become the sensation it arguably should have. The story, so grotesque and horrifying, instead slipped slowly into the shadows of history, leaving only fragments in newspapers, scattered reports, and whispered local memory. Several factors contributed to its disappearance. First, the time period itself. The early 1900s lacked the mass media networks that could turn a local tragedy into national outrage. Stories of crime traveled slowly, and sensational reporting was often reserved for cities or cases. that could be easily packaged for a curious public. Rural Appalachia, remote and difficult to access, was simply off the map for most reporters. Second, there was discomfort, the notion that to women apparently ordinary, familiar women could orchestrate such cruelty-challenged contemporary ideas about morality, gender, and community. People weren't ready to accept that women could be the perpetrators of something so calculated, so unfeeling. Instead, the story was minimized, rationalized, or simply ignored. Third, the legal system of the time struggled to process what had happened. Charges were brought, but documentation was inconsistent. Key witnesses faded away. Some men had relocated or passed, and those who survived carried trauma. That made recounting events difficult. The trial, when it happened, was brief compared to the years of suffering endured by the captives. Even newspapers that covered the case often did so in sensational, fragmented, or dismissive ways, making it easy for history to overlook the depth of the crime. And then there was human nature itself. Communities have a way of burying uncomfortable truths. The townspeople, some of whom had suspected or even known more than they admitted, preferred to forget. The Pike sisters' land, now abandoned, became part of local folklore, told in hushed tones, more cautionary tale than historical record. Over time, the names faded, the details blurred, and the story became a shadow and unsettling rumor, rather than a documented event. Yet the importance of remembering cannot be understated. The case highlights how isolation, fear, and silence can allow horrors to persist. It raises questions about morality, complicity, and the limits of law and community oversight. The 37 men who survived remained living testaments to the consequences of unchecked control, but without continued retelling. Even their experiences risked vanishing entirely. In modern times, historians and true crime enthusiasts have sought to reconstruct the events, piecing together newspaper clippings, legal documents, and oral histories. Each fragment reminds us that the story was real, that human lives were held in chains, and that society's inattention can sometimes be as deadly as outright violence. The Pike sisters' barn, once a literal prison, became a symbol of something far larger: the dangers of neglect, the fragility of justice in isolated communities, and the way history can forget even its most shocking chapters when it challenges the stories we tell ourselves about the world. Even more than a century later, the story of the Pike sisters and their barn continues to raise questions that have no easy answers. 37 men survived. Yes, but what about the ones who never made it to the barn? How many other disappearances were quietly erased from the records, lost to fear, isolation, or neglect? History, as we know it, records only what it can confirm, and sometimes it fails to capture the scale of human cruelty. The motives of the Pike sisters remain murky. Why did they choose these men? Why were some released and others kept chained? Were they driven by power, obsession, delusion, or something even darker? Psychological explanations have been offered in modern analysis, but in the absence of diaries, confessions, or personal accounts from the sisters, the truth slips further into shadow. And what about the community? How much did neighbors really know? How many had glimpsed the horror behind the barn doors yet chose silence over action? Their silence allowed decades of suffering to continue. It's a sobering reflection on the consequences of fear, conformity, and the human tendency to look away when confronted with the unimaginable. The legal system itself struggled to respond. With fragmented records, a remote location, and the sheer complexity of the case, justice was partial at best. The story faded, and the memory of what happened remained largely local, whispered among those who dared to remember. In a sense, the case exposes not just individual cruelty, but systemic vulnerability, how gaps in oversight, record-keeping, and social accountability can leave people unprotected for years. Yet, despite all these uncertainties, there is value in remembering. The story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about humanity. It reminds us that evil can exist quietly, methodically, and persistently. That silence can be a tool as potent as violence. That fear and inaction have consequences that echo far beyond a single barn, a single town, or a single generation. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all remains: could something like this happen again? In isolated communities, under the cover of routine and fear, how easily might injustice go unnoticed? The Pike Barn is more than history, it's a warning, a cautionary tale for anyone who believes that atrocities can only happen elsewhere, to someone else. We may never fully understand why the Pike sisters did what they did, or how so many lived under their control for so long. But the echoes of their actions, questions, speculation, and the human stories of those 37 men linger. They remind us that history is not just a record of events, but a mirror reflecting both the darkness and resilience of the human spirit. So as we close this chapter, we are left not with neat answers, but with a challenge. To see clearly, to question boldly, and to remember that behind every door left unopened, there may be a story the world cannot afford to forget.